Yeah. So because everything's decentralized, like banking is individual banks, individual goldsmiths, all that kind of whole thing. Um, Eventually, what happens is that countries or city states, like so, technically, actually, the very first uh, um, version of this is actually a city state that does it. It's um, I think it's I think it's Amsterdam, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
That Amsterdam is the first kind of place ever on Earth, as far as I'm aware. So, feel free to fact check me. Um, that creates what's known as a central bank, right?
Okay.
And so a central bank, as you can imagine with the name, is that you have centralized banking. That all the banks, it's you can look at it as like the bank of banks, right? So it's where all the banks kind of get, maybe they're putting their deposits in. The
They
central
keep
bank
their
also,
yeah.
yeah, also dictates kind of what what are the rules around banking, maybe like how much you can lend or all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, how
Excuse
much
me.
money you can give it over again
Yeah.
and again, yeah.
Yeah. So, in central banking, right, you you have it in Amsterdam. You eventually have it in I think it's Sweden.
Okay. Yeah.
Nevertheless, there's a history of it, right? And it's not until kind of like in terms of places like the United States and stuff like that. Really, in the United States, you don't see it until it's 1907.
Yeah,
I
early
think, if I
20th.
remember, 1907 or 1911, something like
It
that.
was just before the First World War. Yeah, it was like
Yeah,
1911 or
yeah,
12 or it was just I think
yeah,
he was Wilson.
somewhere within
Yeah.
there. Again, the history aspect in terms of timeline may not fully matter, but I mean, it kind of does. But for the purposes of our conversation, I feel
At
like
the
it's
moment,
not a
yeah.
huge deal. But yeah, so centralized banking kind of comes about within our like human history, so to speak. Um, like I said, it's the banks of banks, and the way that it works is that the banks within the given area, like so, whatever the central bank governs. Obviously, in our Amsterdam scenario, or not scenario, but in when Amsterdam did it, it would be all the banks within Amsterdam. If it was
Yeah.
Sweden, then it would be all the banks in all of Sweden,
Sweden,
right? If
yeah.
it's the Bank of
It was
England, it's all of
centralated
England.
or
Yeah.
centralized, sorry.
Yes, exactly. So, all of the banks within that area that the bank governs have to give a portion of their deposits to the central bank.
Yeah.
And the reason why they do this is that if, let's say, the same scenario, so slight backtracking or aside or whatever you want to call it, institutional lending does not go away, as you know,
No.
right?
Yes.
You can
We
still get
know
a
that's
loan.
around. Yeah.
Yeah, it still exists. The reality is we loan out more than what banks actually physically own.
Well,
That
yeah.
is the history of of banking.
I think it was 1912 because this is going back to where without me getting too far into it because I haven't read too much into it, but what happened was is some families came to the government and said, you don't worry about the gold reserve, just keep printing money and we'll handle the rest. So for about 100
Yeah.
years, we've been printing money, but we don't actually have the gold reserve to back it.
Oh no, that happens a lot later.
Later,
Not
yeah,
1912.
okay, yeah,
Yeah.
that is later. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's I'm pretty sure
So yeah, I'm getting it mixed. Yeah, I'm getting my
it's
dates mixed up.
like so okay, if you really want to go down this road, the US I had some notes randomly. the U.S. tried a few times to do centralized banking in the late to early, late 1700s, early 1800s. They tried a couple times, or tried within like over a few years.
Yeah.
Also, early 1800s, like 1816 to 18 like 30s. They tried again. Both times unsuccessful. They couldn't pass it through. I think it was probably couldn't be passed through Congress, or maybe the banks didn't agree. I don't know, one or the
Yeah.
other.
Okay. Just stopped. Yeah.
And it's not until it looks like 1907, 1908, somewhere within there, the U.S. The well, just prior to that, the U.S. goes through another financial crisis, bank runs, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and so J.P. Morgan, who, I mean, a lot of people know that name because they exist as a bank,
Yeah.
um, brought to Congress that he's like, okay, we need to make centralized banking. So that's the Aldrich Verland Act. If you
Okay.
want to get all historical with it.
Yeah.
But that's basically the act that was passed by Congress to create centralized banking.
Banking.
So
Okay.
yeah, early 1900s is basically what you need to know. But yeah, it going kind of back to kind of what we were talking about is just the centralized banking is designed to bail out banks. So in the case of the United States, like we'll get into this, but like the United
Yeah.
States has the Federal Reserve. Canada has the Bank of Canada. England has the Bank of England, so on and so forth, right? And so these central banks, they take in the deposits, or a portion of the deposits from all these banks, right? That are under their governing ship.
Yeah.
And those banks, though they are still kind of over lending, they're over leveraging themselves. If they ever run into a situation where enough people come and say, hey, I would like to withdraw my money, my gold, they, even if they can't cover it, they can go to the central bank and say, hey, I need to pay out this
So and
amount.
so. Yeah.
Yeah, to pay back all the people. It basically allows for the appearance that banks are stable, that they haven't overspent or over leveraged their money, right?
Money. Yeah.
That's the big kind of value
Yeah.
of a centralized banking. So for all we know as everyday people, right? I got my money, so I'm not worried. There's no bank run, right?
Yeah.
Because there's no panic. There's no, hey, one bank collapsed and another bank collapsed and so on and so forth,
Where is my money
because the
going to be?
central bank
Yeah.
is able to kind of cover that, right?
Yeah.
That, of course. Oh, I should say the other kind of cool thing that comes out of a lot of central banking is prior to that, each bank, just like the goldsmiths, had their own banknotes, right? Like their own currency,
Yeah. It's their
like
little
so.
signature. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, their own like stamp type of situation. So you could be walking around a city with banknotes from Braden, banknotes from Jordan, banknotes from whoever,
Yeah.
and they all look kind of different, right? They might be valued the exact same because they're both represented by a certain amount of gold, right? But
Yeah.
the look of them, it's like as if you were playing with Monopoly money from a bunch of different versions of Monopoly, right? Like,
Yeah.
but you're playing on the same board in that sense, right? Like, so it's all kind of maybe different colors, different images, all that kind of stuff. Central banks kind of can all that and say this is the form of currency that all of the banks will be using.
Going forward.
Doesn't
Yeah.
matter if you are in this area, your money looks like this. And that's why today, right, like we have if you go whatever, you want to get a $20 bill from TD Bank or whatever, like
Yeah.
it's going to look the same as if I went to RBC or CIBC or
Exactly.
BMO
Yeah.
or whatever, right? Like it's all the same in that sense. And that's the
Standardized.
same
Yeah.
just about really anywhere in the world, right? Like the States or India or
They have,
China,
everyone's got
all.
their own. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So that's a kind of another cool aspect. So it centralized banking, it's the way to bail out the banks, and it also is the way to kind of dictate some of the rules, right? So obviously the look of the currencies is one thing. The other aspect is how much people are allowed to lend out, right? How many times over can you lend your money? So
Yeah.
one, they've already taken some of their money in the first place as like a safety net, but um, certain central banks still control the amount of lending, like how many times over. Like uh, let's say whatever 60% of my deposits have to go to the central bank, so I'm left with my like 40% of total deposits, right, on
Yeah.
book. How many times can I take that 40% of book
Ouch.
value and lend it out, right? Like, can I do it 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times,
Before it's
so
not
on and
worth
so forth?
anything. Yeah.
Well, or before I kind of broken the rules. Now there are some jurisdictions where they don't, and that kind of is like a bit of a history that's changed a lot. But in the beginning, it was more focused around the bailout, and then they still said, banks, you can take that 40% and do whatever you
What
want
was
with it,
it?
right? Like,
Yeah.
so, of course, if the central
Okay.
bank can't cover the
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 costs.
total amounts of loans, then yeah, that's when you get into central banks failing, as
Yes.
well. Which in history that has kind of been the case, but a lot of central banks were kind of smart enough to think about, hey, you can only do this whatever 5 times, 9 times over,
Yeah. Not 10
right?
times. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Based off of the total value of things. So um that all works kind of great. Again, minor bank run type of situations do happen, based off of, like we said, the overlending of things. But for the most part, central banks were aware of like the kind of sweet spot for the amount of lending that banks could do, and they were able to cover it.
Yeah.
Fast forward to 1929.